The first shell missed us by a memory. Metal tore the air where our wing had just been, and the cockpit lit white as if someone had struck a match inside a thunderhead. I felt the floor shiver through my boots, smelled cordite over the hot oil breath of the engines, and tightened my hands on the canvas straps that kept me from being thrown down the aisle. The boys on the stretchers didn't move. Morphine does that. Stillness that looks like peace until the aircraft lurches and their faces tell you it wasn't. We were too low for comfort and too high for mercy, a fat-bellied transport pretending it could dance. The pilot's voice came back along the frame, thin and calm. Hold on. Almost there. Almost there. In a sky like this is a prayer wrapped in a lie. I checked dressings by feel, knuckled a clamp tighter, pulled a blanket back up over a kid whose teeth had started to chatter though the cabin was warm with engine heat. Outside, the tracers arced like someone was stitching the dark closed, red thread on black cloth, and we were the mistake the seamstress meant to cut. We dropped toward a strip they'd carved from a field and promised would hold together one more night. The landing lights were hooded to a whisper. Someone had painted a cross at the end of the runway that you could only see if you wanted to. I wanted to. The wheels hit hard and bounced, and every stretcher hook on the rack sang the same high, angry note. I leaned over the nearest boy, so if something came loose it would hit me first. He was 19 by his dog tags and 80 by his eyes. "You'll be home before this bandage knows your name," I said, and felt the lies settle warm in the space between us like a blanket I didn't deserve to tuck. The brakes grabbed unevenly, and the aircraft crabbed, tail twitching like a spooked horse. We rolled to a halt nose on to a berm of churned earth and sandbags. The crew chief kicked the door and night flooded in. Wet, metallic, loud with engines that weren't ours. Ground men ran low, arms up for stretchers, boots sinking in mud that remembered daylight. I slid the first litter toward them, counting my patience under my breath. 1, 2, 3, because numbers behave when nothing else does. The second boy's forehead backed up. I lowered the bag, coaxed the vane with a thumb until the line remembered its job. A flare went up somewhere beyond the hedgerow and turned everyone into cutouts. White faces, black sockets. Hands that were only hands again when the light died. The field surgeon shouted through the racket that the aid post was overflowing, and if we could take 2 more back, they were light enough to fly. Light enough, such a cruel, practical phrase. I nodded before the pilot could say no. He didn't. He just glanced at the fuel gauge like a man peeking at a watch at his own wedding and said, "Make it fast." We loaded morphine, plasma, a satchel of blood typed in a hurry, and 2 lads with bandaged legs who apologized for being trouble. I strapped them in and told them it was an honor to be their nuisance. The crew chief beat the door shut with his palm. The runway ahead looked shorter now that we knew its temper. The pilot ran the engines up and let them scream against the brakes until the whole airframe trembled like a held breath. When he released, we surged forward, and every loose thing in the world tried to remember gravity. I braced the 2 new lads with my hips and forearms, one hand on a swaying fore, the other keeping a dressing where it belonged. Tracers walked in from the tree line like someone counting to us with red fingers. The crew chief yelled low, 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 and the pilot answered by flattening US against the strip until dirt rattled the fuselage and the hedges blurred into a single dark wave. A shell tour opened the night to our left. White glare, a slap of air, and the port engine coughed, caught, held. We were too heavy by any sane rule, but sanity wasn't flying. The end of the runway came up like an accusation. We cleared the berm by a rumor and dropped into the black beyond it, wheels tucking up with the sulky clunk of tired knees. I counted my boys again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and listened for the sounds that meant trouble. Wet breathing, a field dressing going warm, the silence that isn't sleep. The morphine lad's lashes fluttered. I laid 2 fingers on his wrist and borrowed his pulse until mine learned the beat. Behind my shoulder, the crew chief thumped the frame twice, the signal that meant we bought ourselves another sky. I looked down the aisle at those young faces and said the only prayer I trust up here. Keep the pressure steady, keep the metal honest, keep the blood where it belongs. Then I smiled like we were already above the weather and told them we'd be seeing stars in 3 minutes. If the sky didn't give us any, I would. Leveling off felt like standing up in a moving room. The pilot eased a notch of throttle back, and the engine settled into that weary, loyal song I trusted more than speeches. The altimeter's needle climbed like a careful climber. The horizon, invisible, agreed to exist because we needed it to. I moved stretcher to stretcher the way you move through a ward when the ward is trying to shake you off, checking pupils with a penlight that had outlived 3 uniforms, loosening a tourniquet a single turn, sealing a seep with a square of gauze and a palm that would not tremble now and could cry later. Tell me something good, one of the leg boys said, teeth set against the bumps. Something stupid. I gave him stupid. I told him about a hen on the field back at base that had fallen in love with our starboard wheel and laid her eggs beneath it like it was a respectable rooster. He grinned despite himself. She's got taste, he said. That will brought me home last time. I said it would do it again and lied with the confidence of a woman who has watched lies turn into facts through sheer persistence. Over the intercom, the navigator read wind like a fortune, cross at 10, drift 5, cloud building ahead. The crew chief passed me a canteen, and I would a swab for cracked lips, the small comforts that prove we're still human in a crate built for physics. I checked a dressing and caught a smear of red on my cuff. I folded it twice so neither of us would have to see it. Somewhere below, guns groped for us with sound more than sight, and the tracers thinned, then quit, like a bar fight losing interest. I told them what I always tell the ones awake enough to borrow courage, that the night is longer than we are, but not meaner, that the runway lights at home are shy until you flirt, that there is a nurse on the ground who thinks I'm a menace and will fight me for their charts, and that I plan to let her win. One boy laughed, then winced, then said, "Save it for her," and I said I would, and meant it. Above the drone, the air turned smooth, the way water does when it decides to forgive the stones. Clouds stacked ahead like dark furniture in a hallway. The navigator wanted left, the pilot liked center, the weather didn't care. We slid into it, and the world narrowed to metal, breath, and faith. The temperature stepped down a rung, and the cabin air went thin in that way that makes voices small. I cracked open the oxygen bottle and set the mask for the worst of my lot, the boy with the shocky pulse and the skin that couldn't decide between pale and paper. His eyes flickered, searching for a horizon that wasn't there. I put my hand where horizons live, sternum, steady, and said, "Stay with me. We're not done arguing." A bump rolled through us. 1, 2, then the long, smooth shove of air that means we've crossed a boundary we can't see. The 4-line tried to sulk. I sweet-talked it with a warm compress I kept in my pocket like an old superstition. It relented because sometimes the body accepts kindness when it refuses instruction. The leg boy asked what I'd do after the war. I told him I was opening a cafe that only served tea to men who promised not to bleed on the floor. He smiled, then hissed, and I eased his splint a notch, snugged the blanket, tucked it as if tucking could undo the night. The intercom popped. Radio says weather over home is touchy. Tower wants us tight on approach, no sightseeing. The pilot kept his voice level, that calm you can lean against. I checked the morphine lad again, pulse finding a rhythm, chest a better machine than an hour ago. When the air smoothed, the crew chief walked the aisle with that sideways stance flyers get, passing me fresh dressings and a look that asked without asking. "You good?" I nodded because we were, for this minute, and minutes are the units courage comes in. We broke the far edge of the weather like swimmers lifting out of cold water. Faces first, lungs deciding to forgive. The clouds fell behind us in torn shelves, and the world returned in pieces, a smear of coast, a lighthouse blinking the world's oldest lullaby, then the faint quilt of fields where someone would be scolding a cow for not respecting fences. The pilot trimmed a hair, and the nose settled. The engine note found that humble, faithful pitch that means we're going to try landing instead of legend. I did the round that matters. Hands, eyes, breath. A fingertip to each wrist. A glance at pupils that now remembered how to close down sensibly. A palm on a shoulder to borrow heat in both directions. I swapped a dressing that had given up the argument, bled a line of air from the plasma, and retaped a stubborn cannula with the persuasion only a tired woman can manage. "What do you see out there?" the leg boy asked, voice small but curious. "Home pretending it's bigger than it is," I said, which is exactly how home should be. The intercom crackled. Tower cleared us straight in. "Keep it tidy." The pilot's hands made little corrections I could feel through the deck, gentle like steering a pram past potholes. I tucked blankets one last time. Ritual, medicine, maybe both, and took the talisman from my pocket. A washer on a string I rubbed before every landing since the night attire didn't fail because I asked it politely. Superstition is just physics with better manners. 3 minutes, I told them, and this time I wasn't lying. The crew chief braced by the door, one hand on the latch, counting down in a language of knots. The runway lights winked awake ahead, shy at first, then certain, and the black water off to starboard lifted its shoulders and let us pass. I strapped in where I could still reach 2 pulses and made my bargain with the ground. We arrive, we roll, we keep what we brought. The threshold between sky and earth is always a little violent. Wheels kissed, skidded, decided to love us after all. The tail wobbled like a thought changing its mind. The pilot eased her straight and let the weight sit down. Reverse and brake, thunder in our bones. Then the sweet, mortal rattle of metal that has chosen to remain one piece. We rolled past the timid end of the lights and taxied into a bay where lanterns wore hoods and men's faces had the relief of memory returning. Door open, night in, hands up, mind the head, I said, and the ground crew didn't, and one did, and we all pretended he had. We slid the first litter out and across shoulders that had lifted too many and would lift too many again. I kept a palm on each boy as he passed like stamping him paid. Pulse, breath, eyes. The field matron met us at the threshold with a clipboard that could command storms. She gave me her hard look, the one that says I will fight you for those charts, and I gave her my softer one, the one that says I know. The bargain held. Inside the flap, the air changed temperature and smell, iodine, damp canvas, hope rationed like sugar. I rattled through handovers, morphine here, plasma there, dressing change at 20, watch the left lung. He lies about pain when he smiles. The youngest tried to thank me with a joke. I took the joke and told him I'd send it back cleaned and patched. He believed me because he wanted to and because I did. Behind me, the crew chief shouted fuel, and the pilot shouted weather, and the night shouted back with engines arriving from distances that make mothers hold their breath. Back on the apron, the wind carried the smell of wet grass and hot metal, the perfume of survival. I climbed the ramp to sweep the cabin for anything we'd regret leaving. A clamp under the stretcher rack, a cap rolled against the bulkhead, a dog tag that had slipped its boy. I found a note wedged by a rib, 3 words in pencil, tell my ma. No name, no address, just faith that strangers keep promises. I folded it into my pocket with the reverence of a medal and vowed to become the right stranger. The crew chief handed me fresh kits, plasma, morphine, gauze, and the little luxuries the quartermaster pretended not to see. Boiled sweets, decent soap, a comb. We restocked like people laying out plates before guests arrive, knowing who they'll be by the shadows they cast. The pilot leaned out of the cockpit, face pale with the kind of fatigue that has to be saved for later. 10 minutes, he asked the night. The night shrugged. I told him I could be faster if the sky would be kinder. He smiled, the thin one he used when his hands were already back on the yoke in his head. I took 30 seconds to sit on the ramp with my feet in the rain and breathe the ground into my lungs. It helps. Reminds the body it belongs somewhere that doesn't move. A jeep growled up with 2 medics and a sack of mail. Life and letters arriving in the same tone. One medic passed me a thermos. Tea the color of courage. I drank, burned my tongue, and felt human enough to go airborne again. The next load came on stretchers and shoulders, and one stubborn lad on a crate who insisted he could hop. We made space for his pride and then for his pain. I tied fresh tags to wrists, retied old ones with knots I trusted more, checked pupils in lamplight that wanted to be kind. A chaplain pressed a scrap of paper into my palm, a name, an address, a mother, and I tucked it beside tell my ma. 2 promises growing heavier by being kept. Over the intercom, the navigator called a window through the weather like a door you only see if someone points. The crew chief sealed the hatch with the flat of his hand and mouthed the little prayer he only admits to after brandy. I walked the aisle one last time, tucking blankets, tightening straps, lying as needed. We'll be above the muck in 5. The sea is quiet tonight. I've seen worse, and so will you when you're bragging about this to anyone who'll listen. We rolled. Engines up, brakes down, the familiar tremor of a machine deciding, once again, to wager itself on lift. As the runway blurred into a single bright intention, I felt the old fear try to climb my throat, and I held the ladder for it until it remembered how to behave. We lifted, the lights fell away, and the dark welcomed us back like an accomplice who never asks for a cut. Counting, I said to the racks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the aircraft answered with that faithful, workman's hum that means it will try as hard as we do. 10 minutes into the climb, the cabin lurched sideways as if the air had remembered an argument. A tray slid. I caught it with a knee and a muttered apology to gravity. The boy on the crate, our hopper, went gray and quiet in a way that set every bell ringing in my ribs. I peeled back the blanket. The bandage on his thigh had gone from obedient to ambitious. Blood talks. This spoke in a hurry. I clamped high, pressed hard, felt the hot push against my palm, and said to him the thing that slows panic. Look at me. Breathe like you're bored. He stared, obeyed, found the rhythm. I tightened the improvised tourniquet one notch, then another, watching his face instead of the wound because faces tell you what numbers hide. The force stuttered. I purged the air with a flick and a prayer, then warmed the line with my fist till the drip remembered who it worked for. Across the aisle, a chest dressing bubbled at the edge, sucking, not blowing. I stripped it and slapped a fresh three-sided seal, left the fourth loose for air to flee the way afraid things should. The aircraft hit a pocket and dropped. I planted my boots and rode the floor like a stubborn mule until the air changed its mind. Status, the crew chief shouted back. Buying time, I said, and felt the hopper's pulse tip from frantic toward possible. I tucked a boiled sweet into the mouth of the leg boy who'd asked for stupid earlier. Payment in advance, I told him, for the tea room. He smiled like it hurt, less than not smiling. The weather thickened into a living thing that wanted rent. Ice began to feather the window frames, delicate as gilt. I rubbed a smear away with my sleeve and saw nothing but our own reflection staring back. Me, the boys, the straps, the little republic of promises we had formed at altitude. The navigator called for a turn to dodge a squall line. The pilot rolled us gentle but firm, and the aisle tilted just enough to make a careless not confess. I retied it before it sinned again. The hopper's color improved by a shade you could argue about. I slid fresh gauze under my palm without lifting pressure, swapped hands, checked cap refill like a fortune teller reading a thumb. The chest lad's breath found a less vindictive rhythm. The three-sided seal flittered and held. I tucked a blanket tighter around the morphine boy because warmth is half of medicine and the half you can always afford. You lot owe me a quiet 5 minutes, I said, and the engines, bless them, chose that moment to hum like old friends deciding to forgive. We broke free of the worst of it. The sky opened just enough to let the horizon shake our hands. The crew chief slid me a wink and a packet of sugar he'd been hoarding like treasure. I pocketed it to bribe a pulse later. Ahead, the navigator's voice softened. Home plate in 20, winds cooperative for a change. The pilot answered with a tiny, grateful laugh you could miss if you didn't know the sound of a man dropping a stone he's been carrying since takeoff. The coast rose out of the dark like a promise keeping itself. Beacon flash. Count to 3, beacon flash. I did a last, deliberate round. Clamps snug, tags legible, blankets behaving, straps not arguing with bone. The hopper's eyes had come back from wherever pain had sent them. Still ugly, he asked. You'll spoil my tea room decor, I said. He grinned and then surrendered to the sort of exhaustion you only earn. Straight in again. The intercom said, merciful words. The pilot trimmed. The nose dipped. We came down the long, invisible stair. I rubbed the old washer on its string and made the quiet pact I always make with the ground. Let us arrive, and I will not ask for applause. The runway lights brightened like shyness overcome. The wheels met earth with a firm handshake. Brake, roar, rattle, and then the slow exhale of a machine that has done its part. We taxied to the bay. Door. Night. Hands. I passed the hopper down with my pressure still on him until another palm replaced mine. Don't let go till she says so, I told the orderly, jerking my head at the matron waiting like a small, efficient fate. The chaplain met me at the ramp, eyes asking about promises. I tapped my pocket. Kept, I said. He nodded like that was a sacrament. The pilot caught my eye over the wing root and lifted 2 fingers. Again, I nodded back. The sky hadn't run out of work. The raid reports said the corridor would be quieter after midnight. The The corridor had not read them. We launched into a sky scraped raw by searchlights, the beams making white scars on cloud. I settled us early, 4 lines secured with an extra loop, tourniquets checked but slack, splints padded at every vengeful edge, blankets tucked as if they were contracts. The crew chief killed the hatch light, and we flew by the small coin of my pen lamp, the world reduced to the radius of care I could reach. A crack rattled the skin by my elbow, Flak or the ghost of it. Close, the crew chief said, which was his way of saying not today. I leaned over a boy whose breath still didn't trust him and counted with him like you count sheep out of a burning field. In 2-3, out 2-3. He matched me, then owned the rhythm. The navigator threaded us between 2 storms, voice low, like a man reading a poem to a nervous dog. I told a story I saved for dead air. The time we diverted to a grass strip and landed among goats who considered us rude and then forgave us for bleeding. Laughter in a cabin like this is a small rebellion. Even the engines seemed to approve, smoothing into that sane, solid tone you get when a pilot is both humble and good. Midway out, the radio squawked the reroute, enemy party nosing along our usual lane. We slid south a handful of miles into air that felt unused. Stars pried apart the overcast, and the sea showed its back in dull pewter, calm enough to be generous. I swapped a bottle of plasma and felt the sting in my forearm that meant I'd nicked myself somewhere. I ignored it. Skin heals, time doesn't. The boy with the sealed chest tapped my wrist. You think I'll run again? He whispered, ashamed of wanting it. You'll run to things that matter, I said, and meant something broader than boots. The hopper slept like men sleep when they've bargained with pain and won a temporary treaty. I rechecked tourniquets and released one a notch, the luxury of progress. The crew chief passed me a scrap, ink scrawl from the pilot. Crosswind on return, prep for a dance. I smiled, tucked it into my pocket with the promises, and told the awake ones our landing might be stylish. I've got 2 left feet, one said. Good, I said. So does our runway. Home came early, a smear of light cradled in black. Tower cleared us for a curtsy instead of a bow. On final, a gust shouldered us like a drunk uncle. The pilot rode it with quiet dignity and then set us down as if lowering a sleeping child into a bed too narrow. We rolled long. The brakes sang. We made the turn with inches to spare and pride intact. I handed over the chest lad with the instruction to keep his seal honest and his breath lazier than his fear. The matron raised an eyebrow at my improvised tape job and then, graciously, approved it with a grunt. The hopper woke enough to wink at me. Tell your tea room I'm bringing my own sugar, he said. You're paying corkage, I said, and let the orderlies steal him. Back in the hall, I found a dog tag under a blanket and knew the name it bore was now in safer hands. Mine until I could place it where love would find it. The pilot signaled fuel enough for one more bravery if the sky asked politely. It didn't. For once, the night agreed to let us be ordinary. We took it. Dawn made a thin gold seam along the horizon. We launched into it with a load lighter than my pocket felt. Only 3 this time, all conscious, all insisting they were fine. You're not, I said kindly, and won 3 reluctant smiles. The air up there had washed its face. We climbed through clean blue that made the engine sound hopeful. I almost trusted it. Over water, a lone burst of flak went off with bored malice, far enough to be impolite rather than lethal. I checked splints, loosened socks, massaged a foot until it remembered circulation and gratitude. One boy watched my hands the way people watch someone bandage a book. How many fights you done? He asked. Enough to have favorites, I said. This one's applying. The navigator read a wind that would push us home like a helpful aunt. I took that gift and worked ahead, prepped new dressings, pre-labeled tags, cut tape strips I would pretend were miracles later. Preparation is just future kindness. Halfway, the radio died into a static that sounded like frying, then returned with a clipped say again from tower. The pilot worked the set like a fiddle. The navigator scribbled a new vector that avoided a weather tantrum. I used the lull to pull out the 2 notes in my pocket, tell my ma and the chaplain's mother, and copied the names I had into my head twice. Memory is a risky briefcase. Still, it's one you can carry through customs. One of the boys asked about superstition. We have plenty, I said, most of them polite. I rub a washer before we land. Our pilot won't step over a fuel hose. The crew chief refuses to shave on days ending in Y. He snorted. What about you? I tapped the breast pocket where the promises lived. I write it down before the sky can take it. He nodded like that was science. We slipped under a stray cloud, and the sea gave us back our reflection. Small, stubborn, moving with intent. The engines held their pitch like men in choir who love the work more than the applause. Approach cleared, runway awake, wind flirting but not cruel. I did the last checks like bedtime rituals. Pulses, pupils, straps, breaths. I taught one boy the trick of breathing through a landing. Out on the bump, in on the roll, and he mastered it in a single circuit like he planned to boast about it later. We touched, rolled, turned, and parked with the relief of clasping hands after a long argument. The matron and I conducted our liturgy, report, handover, admonition, thanks disguised as complaint. You and your inventions, she grumbled at my tape. They work, I said. For now, she said, which is the only horizon medicine ever gets. I pressed the copied names into the chaplain's palm. I'll add the addresses, he promised. You'll keep the promises, I said. Always, he answered. In the quiet after, I sat on the ramp and let the ground enter my bones. The pilot joined me, silent, sharing the sort of tired that doesn't ask for language. Above us, gulls argued about nothing with impressive commitment. We let them win. The last run of the cycle, a dusk that couldn't pick a side. We lifted with a cargo of youth and stubbornness and one sergeant who apologized for taking up space. That's my job, I told him, to make space. The corridor out was oddly empty, either luck or a trap, and we treated it as both. I tied the sergeant's four with a knot my grandmother used on laundry. Won't slip when it's wet, won't strangle when it's dry. Halfway, a searchlight found our wake like a finger tracing a page. The pilot dropped us a whisper, slid left, then right, then under, letting brightness chase shadows it could never quite hold. Tracers reached and failed. The crew chief tapped the frame twice. Not today. I checked everyone's faces for that waxy sheen fear paints and found only a matte worry I could live with. The sergeant asked what kind of stars we'd see tonight. All the stubborn ones, I said. The ones that don't quit just because the clouds disapprove. He closed his eyes and made a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a prayer. On the way home, the wind turned meddlesome. Cross gusts shouldered us at odd intervals, like the sky had decided to test our posture. I braced and taught the awake ones the landing breath again. The trick gives men something to own. The morphine boy stirred and asked if we were nearly there. We are the sort of nearly that counts, I said, and he believed me because I gave him a hand to hold and because belief is a team sport. The radio gave us pattern entry and a warning about birds. We all looked at each other and then at the bulkhead because you can't do anything about birds except be humbler than them. The pilot set us up for a crab and straightened just before the wheels confessed to ground. A bump, a roll, a correction, and then the long, grateful rumble of choices that had been the right size. We taxied in under a sky that had decided to let evening be evening. The crew chief opened the door to the smell of cut grass and petrol, the scent of armistice between flights. I counted pulses I already knew, checked straps I trusted, and told the sergeant the tea room would always have a chair his size. He said he'd stand. I said I'd make him sit. We decided to argue about it later. We handed them down into hands that knew the choreography. Names, tags, orders, glances. The matron took custody like a dragon guarding treasure and shooed me when I hovered. Go wash your hands and your conscience, she said. One of those will cooperate. I laughed, and it came out as something softer. On the ramp, the pilot leaned against the fuselage and looked at the strip as if it were an old friend who had kept an awkward promise. That it, he asked. For tonight, I said. He nodded, grateful for the honesty of limits. The crew chief flicked the hatch light off and on twice, his private benediction, and then swung it shut. I walked once more through the empty cabin, touching the places where fear had sat and courage had laid down. On the floor by a tie-down ring, I found a boiled sweet I'd meant to give away. I put it in my pocket for tomorrow and felt the weight of small mercies add up to something I could carry. Outside, the air smelled like rain thinking about it. I rubbed the washer and made my last bargain of the night. Let the ones we carried wake to faces that know their names. I can manage on fewer hours. I cannot manage on fewer truths. If the sky asks again, we'll go again. That is the job and the vow. And if anyone ever asks what we gave under fire, I will tell them this. Not just blood and bandages and borrowed pulses, but the refusal to let a boy be alone between earth and sky. We flew through it, and we brought them home.